The subway car was crowded enough to feel like a living organism, every body a cell in a humming, impatient bloodstream. The air carried a tang of wet concrete and coffee. Metal poles reflected 1,000 rickety gears of life circling inside the cabin. Breath hissed out invisible puffs of heat. The car slowed into a dawn-lit station, lights flickering as if woken from sleep by a distant dream. The announcements rolled hollowly through the car's speaker, a robotic lullaby that promised nothing but punctuality and maintenance reports. The dawn that pressed at the windows wasn't the ordinary sunrise, but something else, an encore the city had rehearsed but never performed. The doors opened to a corridor of pale light and the pressure of time, and then they closed, sealing the car back into its own private weather. The crowd parted for a moment as a memory rose to the surface, as if the walls themselves exhaled a long breath. In the midst of the crowd moved a woman with a quiet clearness to her gaze. She wore a coat the color of smoke-lit steel, and her eyes carried a map of every alley and memory the city had ever kept. Her name was Kestrel, a quantum detective who walked with a patience born of long nights, waiting for a signal in the static between places. She didn't look around so much as absorb. The way the door's stiff metal mesh sounded when they sighed closed, the way the station's fluorescent glare turned a streak of dust on the floor into a tiny comet. Her hand brushed against a small device at her belt, a palm-sized thing with a glass face. It wasn't pretty functional, a little rough around the edges, but it hummed with a quiet electricity that spoke of arcs and possibilities. It was the Quietus, Mara's bailiwick, a detector for time ripples and entanglements. It didn't reveal all futures, not even most. It gave you the places where a future might reach through the present with its gluey fingers and pull something else into reality. It wasn't prophecy, it was a weather forecast for possibility. The car began its glide again, each car's movement, a subtle tremor in space-time, a mechanical heartbeat designed to translate human worry into motion. The silence after the dawn seemed to seep through the car's windows and floors, as if someone had pressed a mute against the city's chorus, and the city complied, listening for something it already knew would arrive. And it did. Along the far side of the car, a figure rose from the crowd, as if someone had lifted him up from inside the people themselves. He wore a coat of deep, unusual blue, dyed with a shade that suggested twilight and rain. His face was aged and young at once, a map of a life that had lived through too many yesterdays and too few tomorrows. He moved with a careful, practiced ease, not to blend into the crowd, but to survive its attention. The man introduced himself with a small bow that didn't feel theatrical so much as necessary. "Kale," he said, and the name rode the echo of a long corridor in his voice. "I've been waiting to meet you, detective." Mara inclined her head as if in permission or perhaps in habit. She studied him with the cool distance of someone who spoke to time as much as to people. The Quietus pulsed once, then settled. The device's screen showed a line that moved and then paused, a heartbeat of data in a forest of potentialities. "Kale," she repeated, letting the name settle in her mouth until it became something solid, something she could hold. "You're not from around here, are you?" Kale offered a small, rueful smile. "Not from this decade, more likely. Maybe a few cities keeps changing its mind about what time is allowed to be." The car took a downward curve into a tunnel, the world above them turning to dirt and echo. The light inside the car thickened to the brightness of a sunrise seen through a pale ocean. A memory of dawn pressed in on Mara from all sides, a chorus of strangers, each narrating futures they hadn't lived. "Strangers narrating futures," Mara said, almost to herself, and it felt right to speak aloud the city's unrehearsed confession. "That's the principle you're here to test." Kale's eyes shifted toward the crowd, his gaze skimming along the lines and faces as if seeking a direction in a city made of questions. "The city's not a god, detective. It's a ledger," he said softly, though the words seemed almost to spill out of him as if the idea had always lived within him and merely found a voice now. "And every future we hear is another entry made in its margins. At that moment, a whistle of static clung to the air, and the car's floor microphones picked up something that sounded like a single, distant, diminishing cry. It wasn't a scream. It was the kind of sound you hear when a city tries to remember something it has forgotten, an imprint that refused to die. The car's doors hissed open at a stop that shouldn't have allowed a breath between seconds. A gust of wind came through the car's narrow corridor, carrying with it a scent of rain and ozone and something else Mara couldn't quite name. The memory of a future the city had not yet learned to forget. People spilled out, and the car grew suddenly quieter, as if the crowd's energy had been siphoned away by something they couldn't describe. Mara stepped to the edge of the car and watched a figure step off into the station's pale light. It was a woman with bare wrists and a soft light in her eyes, the light of someone who had grown used to a long absence and now found that absence filling up again in ways she hadn't anticipated. That woman was Ada Lorne, a journalist who had learned to live on the margins of time, chasing stories that didn't just predict tomorrow, but insisted on being remembered by it. She didn't notice Mara immediately, but Mara knew Ada as surely as she knew her own pulse. Ada moved with a quiet urgency that made Mara notice her presence, even without the other's conscious intention. She lifted her camera, then lowered it with a curious gesture that was almost a bow to the air itself. She spoke into the camera's lens with a voice that could coax the truth from the air, like a dog coaxing a scent from the wind. "Every time," Ada said, as if continuing a sentence she had started long ago. "The city shivers, we forget, and then we remember again in the most inconvenient moments." She scanned the car with eyes that seemed to search for a story rather than a seat. "I've learned to listen to the memory's edge. It's where futures bite back." Mara turned toward Ada, letting the moment's tension fall away into something more practical. "If you hear something, you should tell me," Mara said, "because otherwise the city will tell you first, and I'll be left holding the evidence that nothing happened." Ada's smile flickered across her face, a momentary thing that suggested a private joke shared between two people who understood the city's language deeply. Then she looked away, toward Cale, as if to include him in a conversation she had not yet had but knew would come. The car's ceiling shimmered, with faint, almost inaudible threads of light, the memory stream that Mara used to listen for entanglements. The quietus hummed in a way that suggested it was listening to, not just to Mara's surroundings, but to the shapes of the time that wanted to speak through the city's lungs. "Time refugee," Mara asked, because it felt like the right word to say aloud. The phrase that might coax honesty from a story that was not yet ready to tell. It was the term people used when they faced the possibility that their time might be stolen or borrowed or translated into something else entirely. Cale didn't flinch at the phrase. If anything, his gaze sharpened as if he recognized the word's weight for what it was, a key to a locked door. "Refugee," he echoed softly, tasting the syllables as if they were something cold and precious that might break if he spoke too loudly. "Not of a war or a famine, though there are those memories in my blood. It's more." "What is it?" Mara asked, the city's breath becoming heavier around them, the air dense with the sense of a story that could tip into danger at any moment. Cale's mouth pressed into a thin line. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles, pale where the skin disappeared into the thought of a future he could no longer claim. "Time is a road that sometimes ends at a gate we cannot cross," he said, and his voice carried a warning that seemed to settle into the car like a damp fog. "I'm a guide of sorts, not a guard, but I've learned some doors are not doors at all, but traps for memories." Before Mara could respond, the quietus vibrated with a quick, sharp thrumming that sounded almost like a heartbeat's panic. The device screen flashed, showing a name, a corridor of numbers, a line that pointed toward a location not far from their current stop. "Something's happened," Mara said, more to herself than to the others. The memory leak, the thing Mara hunted in the city's living rooms and subway tunnels, had found them again. A ripple, a crack that opened for the briefest moment to show a future that shouldn't exist yet, or at least wasn't ready to be seen in public. Kale nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated this moment for a long time and was waiting for Mara to catch up. "The city's ready to tell a different story," he said, "but only if you listen." And the listeners need to be listening, not with their ears, but with their attention. Mara turned to Ada, who had stepped back into the seat Mara had just vacated, camera low, eyes bright with the hunger for what the future might reveal. Ada's lips curled in a small knowing smile, and she steadied her grip on her camera, as if the lens could anchor the city's memory, the way a rope anchors a climber to a cliff. "Where do we go?" Ada asked quietly. As if the words could travel in the quiet between heartbeats and find an answering pulse somewhere in the walls. Kale's gaze scanned the car, stopping on Mara for a fraction of a moment longer than necessary. It was as if he could see the immediate future, could glimpse the next few steps in their dance through time and space, and he chose the steps with precision, as if he were a choreographer with a stubborn dancer. "The city wants to show us a lie that pretends to be history," Kale said at last. "There's a corridor, a passage of memory, beneath the river that runs under this line. If we go there, we'll see the origins of the loop, the memory loop that's been turning this place into a palimpsest, re-inked with other people's futures whenever it pleases." He paused, letting the idea land, letting the weight of what he was about to propose sink in. "But the corridor is guarded by a faction that believes time is theirs to rewrite. They'll be watching for us." The car crossed a threshold, and the world outside seemed to tilt. The city's architecture bent momentarily into a more fluid shape, like a sleeping animal stretching. The rails beneath them hummed with a sound that Mara recognized, the sound of a city sorting itself. The memory of dawn in the car's interior held a chorus of voices, the strangers who narrated futures they hadn't lived, growing as loud as a chorus in a cathedral that had never been finished. Mara felt the pull of a direction that was not simply physical, but moral. This was a case where the path to truth lay not in extracting a confession, but in listening to a memory that was hungry for meaning. The quietist showed a boundary, a line across which time became a map rather than a road. They would need to cross it if crossing meant leaving something behind. "Show me," Mara said, the word carrying a weight she didn't know she carried until that moment. "Show me the corridor." Kale offered his hand to Mara, and for the first time in her life, Mara felt her own life bend toward a future she hadn't chosen. Or perhaps she had chosen it long ago and forgotten the choice until now. The moment felt as if someone had pulled back a curtain made of time's own silk, and behind it she saw a corridor that smelled of rain and old copper and something else. Fear, yes, but also a stubborn hope, like a plant forcing its way through asphalt. Ada stepped closer, her own presence a different kind of witness. She wasn't here merely to observe, she was here to narrate the act of remembering itself, to remind the city that its stories must be heard by someone other than the clock. The train's rhythm changed, a new tempo that hinted at a revelation. The other passengers, a grandmother knitting a scarf, a young man with staccato breaths, a mother with a child's hand in hers looked up as if they felt the same thing Mara felt, that something momentous was waking up beneath their feet. A lights flickered again, and in that flicker Mara thought she saw faces in the walls, faces that might have been her own ancestors, or avatars from a future she hadn't yet earned the right to inhabit. The corridor lay under the city's river, a seam that bridged what the city remembered with what it had erased. Kale guided them through a maintenance stairwell that descended beneath a maintenance tunnel, below the layer of city's breath where the air carried the memory of every step the city had ever taken. The walls here were not stone, they were a mosaic of time's own handwriting, a ledger of futures that had not yet become the city's reality. The corridor smelled of rain and the old copper of a long-dead subway line. The floor was a grid of metal plates with tiny, almost invisible runes etched into their surfaces. The quietist hummed with a tense energy, as though sensing that in this place, the difference between truth and memory could become dangerously blurry. "We are close," Kale whispered, as if speaking too loudly would wake something that preferred to sleep. "The loop is nested here, in a chamber that the city calls the Mnemo's Vault. It's a room where the city keeps its most intimate stories, dog-eared memories, the moments that define who we are, the ones we wish to forget and never forget at once. Mara followed him, Ada close behind, and for a moment she heard the crowd in the car outside, as if their whispers could seep through the subway's thick old walls. The city was listening, and it wanted to know who would listen back. At the end of the corridor, a door appeared, as if the passage itself had decided to stand upright and present a barrier. It wasn't a door that could be opened with a simple key, or even with a coded pass. It required a willingness to confront a memory. A soft, almost invisible thread of light stretched from the door to Cale's chest. He pressed his hand into the thread, as if it were a line of heat, as if to greet a friend. The thread pulsed, and the door's surface shimmered, as if the memory inside it recognized his touch and responded in kind. "You understand what this is," Cale said, not as a question, but as an invitation to trust a reality they could neither deny nor flee from. "If we step through, we'll be stepping inside the city's own memory, the place where the mansion of time keeps its most dangerous rooms." The Mnemo's Vault holds the truth about the loop, about the city's architect, and about the future that's already happened to us, only we haven't realized it yet. Ada stepped forward, her camera held at her side. She snapped a quick, improvised picture in the general direction of the door, as if the act of recording would grant her permission to pass. The shutter's click sounded oddly loud, like a pistol shot in a quiet room, and when the image appeared on the lens's small screen, she saw not a photograph, but a living map. An image of a corridor that looked both traveled and untraveled, with faint rivers of light flowing along its walls. "We're not alone here," Ada murmured, the thought more to herself than to the others. But Mara heard it anyway. The memory in the Mnemo's Vault wasn't simply a collection of personal histories. It was a battleground where factions fought with the power to rewrite a city's future by rewriting its past. Cale moved first, stepping through the door, as if stepping into a familiar room. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, a faint sigh of electricity ran through the air, and the door's surface dissolved into a field of shifting motes glittering, like dust caught in a shaft of light. Mara followed, then Ada, each of them stepping into a space that existed only because they believed it could. What they found was not a room so much as an atmosphere, an environment that breathed, a space where time's memories lived as though they were trees in a forest, each memory a distinct trunk, each memory's weight pressuring the air around it and altering the room's gravity. The Mnemo's Vault stretched out before them, a chamber with walls that appeared to be woven from threads of memory. The threads glowed faintly in colors Mara could hardly name, colors that did not match any ordinary spectrum, colors that belonged to a world where memory itself had a hue and a texture. In the center stood a pedestal, a simple stone block that glowed with a pale inner light. On the pedestal rested a small device, a cube of crystal, smooth and clear, etched with sigils she did not recognize and yet felt thread through her bones. The cube seemed to breathe, though there was no air in the chamber. Cale approached the pedestal with a reverent caution, as though the cube's presence were a blessing and a warning at once. He laid a hand upon the cube, and a web of memory threads sprang to life, weaving through the chamber in luminous strands. "It's the core," he whispered, as if speaking a truth so old it hurt to hear. "The machine that records the city's memory, the architect's tool. It doesn't build the city, it remembers it into being." Mara looked around, feeling a pressure behind her eyes as if a door to a mind was opening somewhere inside. The memories in the vault swelled and shifted. She felt a tremor of recognition, a whisper of someone she had once known but could no longer recall. The vault's air thickened with something like a storm's breath, and then it cleared again, to reveal a figure who stood not far from the pedestal, a silhouette defined by the memory they shared, a person who was both a stranger and a part of them. The figure stepped into the pale light with a careful gravity that suggested both inevitability and danger. It was a future version of Mara, but not a future she could have chosen or even recognized in the moment it arrived. The figure's eyes held the same calm intensity that Mara had learned to rely on when she looked into the faces of those who would do anything to preserve their version of the truth. "Hello, Mara," the future Mara said, and her mouth used words that were not quite the current Mara's. Mara recoiled, a ripple in time that traveled through her spine. Kale stepped closer, as if ready to shield. Though it was not Mara who needed protection, Ada raised her camera, but lowered it as if recognizing a danger that could not be captured by a single image. The future Mara's voice carried the cadence of a confession. "What you think you know about this city is a story that has been rewritten many times by different hands, in acts that felt necessary at the time. But there is a single constant. The Nemos Vault will reveal the true architect. And that truth will test every loyalty you think you own." "Who is the architect?" Mara asked, her voice, even though the room's gravity made it feel like hoisting a weight with every syllable. The future, Mara's mouth curled into a wry, almost affectionate smile. "Not a who, but a how, a method," she said. "The city's architecture is not the product of a single mind, but the product of a loop that imposes its own order on the memory. It's a logic that rewrites the past to fit a future the loop has already decided to stage." The cube in the pedestal pulsed, responding to the words as if those words unlocked a hidden mechanism within it. The sigils warmed from cold lines to living thread, and the room's walls began to shimmer with a light that wasn't just illumination, but a narrative unfolding. Kale's hand found Mara's shoulder with a quiet pressure, a reminder that they stood on a cliff's edge of possibility. "If the architect is a method," he said, "then the one who uses that method is a guardian or a thief, depending on who holds the key to the ledger." He looked at Mara with a seriousness that felt like an oath. "The loop has a guardian. The guardian is the memory of a city. It's the memory of people who have chosen to forget, who have learned to pretend that ordinary days do not demand extraordinary choices." Mara found her breath and forced it to settle into a rhythm. The memory's weight pressed on them all, a pressure that did not feel oppressive but rather inevitable, like gravity reminding you that you exist. The future Mara's presence seemed to calibrate the room, to make the memory's edges sharper. "Why reveal this now?" Mara asked. "If the loop is manipulative, what would making the truth plain do to us?" The future Mara's gaze settled on Mara's own eyes with a careful scrutiny that seemed almost affectionate, as if she were studying her own reflection for signs of a life she had not yet lived. "Knowledge is a tool," she said gently. "To know the architecture is to be able to disassemble it, or at least to rearrange its pieces so that you can live with the consequences. The city doesn't want merely to be remembered. It wants to decide what it means to keep a memory." There was a sound, the faint crunch of metal against metal, like a finger tapping on a glass. The vault's memory threads suddenly blazed brighter, and the room filled with an urgent, almost desperate energy. A new presence stepped into the vault, not as a person, but as a force, the presence of the faction that had weaponized the loop in the first place. They arrived not to confront the trio, but to announce themselves as the owners of the memory, the masters of the vault's rules, the people who believed time's currency should be held in a vault and not spent in the open. A new arrival wore a coat that absorbed the light around it, a figure whose face Mara could not fully decipher because the light seemed to bend away from the eyes. The person spoke with a voice that was both a whisper and a shout, a trick of time that made it seem both intimate and dangerous. "We are the quiet choir," the figure announced, their words echoing through the Menemos vault like a chorus of footsteps on a wooden floor. "We own this memory room because memory belongs to those who can make it listen. You trespassers are not authorized to glean the truth. The truth is a weapon, and it should not be given to those who can only hear it when it happens to be necessary for their survival. Mara's mouth pressed into a line. She wasn't a fighter in a conventional sense. Her weapons were patience and a careful, almost surgical, honesty. But the choir's claim wasn't about violence. It was about control, about forcing the future by withholding it or by coercing the present to conform to a memory they could be influenced by. Kale stepped forward, his expression calm, but radiating a tremor of resolve. "If memory is a weapon," he said, almost matter-of-factly, "and you are the gun's handler, but you are not the sole owner of time. Time belongs to those who live through it, not to those who rewrite it for the sake of power." Ada's response was the most unguarded thing Mara had ever heard from her editor's daughter's heart. A small but fierce flame of defiance. She raised her camera again, then lowered it, choosing rather to let her hands be the instrument of witness than to risk making a weapon out of an image. The choir's leader, if such a person could be called that, stepped closer, and the room's light bent toward them as if drawn by gravity. "You're bending the memory's edge," the leader said, their voice lower, more intimate now, as if speaking to Mara alone. "You want to cut a door through this vault to a future that is not yours to see. Will not permit it." The confrontation polarized the vault into factions of memory and power, a delicate balance threatening to shatter, and in the eye of the storm stood Mara, Kale, and Ada, their presence a scansion of the story the city itself had invented and then forgotten. Mara's mind, trained to see the long arc of a narrative, and not just its immediate drama, grasped for a way to hold the moment together. She realized that the Nemes Vault wasn't only a repository of history, it was a scanner of intent. The more you asked about what had happened and why, the more the vault drew out your own motives, revealing your own nature as a participant in the story rather than an observer. "Knowledge is not enough," Mara spoke. More to the room than to the choir, but the voice traveled through the vault's luminous threads and found them in their own way. "If you want to protect memory, you must allow the memory to change those who hold it. You must trust strangers." The choir's leader lifted a hand, and the vault's threads intensified, weaving a net that wrapped around Mara, Kale, and Ada. The room's air grew thick, with the sense that the future's weight would be placed upon them, that they would have to bear it in some new form to keep it from collapsing in the present. The future Mara stepped forward and spoke with a careful, intimate clarity, a voice that was both near and far, a whisper across the ages. "You cannot control memory by force," she said, "but you can rebind it with a shared purpose that invites the future to join the present rather than fight it to a standstill." The line of thread the cube produced grew brighter, and the chamber answered with a song. A chorus of tones and words formed from the vault's own history. It wasn't a list of names or dates. It was a vow, a promise to endure the truth, no matter how it bent the city's shape. In that moment, the memory loop began to unravel in slow, deliberate arcs. The choir's claim to sole governance of memory weakened as the truth's music grew louder, and the vault's walls seemed to open outward, as if the room itself learned to breathe more deeply with every breath Mara took. The Menemus vault's flicker of light coalesced into a new form, a map, not of streets but of time's currents. The threads formed rivers that ran not along a fixed route, but through every possible life, through every choice that could be made within the city's fabric. The map suggested that the city's real architect wasn't a single person or even a faction. It was the interplay of countless choices across countless people, a living dial that demanded the cooperation of those who would live within it. And then something else shifted. The future Mara's gaze softened into something almost paternal, and she reached out a hand toward Mara. "If you want to stop the loops from consuming your city," she said, her voice a blend of warning and hope, "you must choose a future that includes all the futures." Mara stepped closer and took the future Mara's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of thousands of moments she hadn't yet lived. She felt Kale's presence at her side, steady and patient, and Ada's camera steadied by the other, recording not a single moment but the possibility of many. The choir's voice lowered, no longer a shout, but a now familiar note in the vault's chorus. If you pursue this path, their leader warned, you will destabilize the loop's control and risk scattering your city's memories into ordinary moments that never grew together. Mara turned to Kale, who looked back at her with a certain sadness, as if he already knew what choices would come next, and which of them would lead to the most difficult sacrifice. Sacrifice, Mara repeated, tasting the word as if it were a bitter, necessary spice. It's the city's currency, isn't it? We've all paid with something we thought we couldn't afford to lose, and we've discovered that loss is time's most honest currency. It's what we trade for a future we can bear. Kale nodded. The last exit gate. His voice was almost a whisper, and for a moment it sounded like a worshipful confession, rather than a statement of policy. Time refugees have one last exit gate. After that, there's no guarantee we'll ever step again into the lives we expect. The line of thought unsettled Mara in a way she hadn't anticipated. She was a woman who believed in action, in deeds that could be measured and weighed, in the kind of choice that would sprout a future she could name. The concept of giving up a last exit gate, an ultimate, perhaps final control over one's own narrative, was something she hadn't prepared herself to confront. Ada, sensing a gravity that exceeded the moment's drama, spoke with the simple, blunt honesty of someone who had spent too long watching futures unfold on screens. If you do this, she said to Kale, what's the point of this whole journey? If you're not in it anymore, what remains of a story that's supposed to be about memory and risk? Kale's answer came not with bravado, but with a quiet, almost reverent acceptance of inevitability. The point of staying is not to own time, but to steward it, he said. If the city's memory belongs to everyone who shares it, then sacrificing one gate is how we remind it that a future isn't granted to a single traveler. It belongs to the people who survive the present's cost and learn to carry that cost into tomorrow. The moment stretched into a breath held by the entire Menemos vault, a pause in which every memory thread, every glow of the vault's walls, seemed to lean in and listen for a choice Mara would make. Finally, Mara made her decision not as a declaration of courage or plan of action, but as a confession of the city's own truth. No one deserved to own memory. It belonged to the living, to the people who would walk the city's streets tomorrow. It belonged to the future that had not yet learned to fear it. Then we share it, Mara said, honoring the principle that memory was a communal resource, something that required all who might be touched by it to bear the burden of its consequences. We share the gate, share the memory, share the future and the risk of it. Her words seemed to unlock something in the vault, a chain reaction of consent and willingness. The choir's hold loosened, the memory threads loosened, and a soft, incandescent line ran from Mara's chest to Kale's palm, to Ada's lens, to the vault's central cube. The room's air brightened, and for a moment the vault ceased to exist as a sealed chamber, and instead became the city's living memory. The people, who had once narrated futures, were now present in every thread of the space, each of them listening to Mara as if to a judge. The decision, and the memory the decision created, began to ripple outward. Within moments, Mara could feel the subways themselves, altering in a way that could be described only as compassion, a sense of shared risk and shared gain. The city's clocks, which had bled data in a corridor of red and blue numbers, now glowed with a gentler light. The data flowing across their faces in a pattern that resembled a heartbeat rather than a code. And then something unexpected happened. Kale stepped away from the cube, his own face suddenly showing a hint of relief, a release he hadn't been aware he bore, until the weight of the decision settled around him. He pressed a hand to his chest, a gesture of relief and sorrow in equal measure. The last gate is no longer a private instrument, Kale announced, though it sounded less like a triumph and more like a verdict that time itself had already pronounced. We've made space for the city to travel with us, rather than us leaving it behind. Ada lowered her camera to her side, her eyes reflecting a mix of awe and relief. She didn't smile in triumph or triumphalism, but in that quiet, stubborn way of someone who had watched 100 timelines converge into a single moment of truth, and found that truth worth sharing. "If memory is a living thing," she whispered, more to the air than to the others, "then we've just given it a name and a home." The choir's leader, or rather the presence that had once claimed the choir's authority, stepped back. The air around them held no anger now, only the kind of resignation that comes when one recognizes that a storm has moved past them and is moving toward the horizon where others stand. "The memory is free," the leader said, not with triumph, but with a kind of weary respect. "We will watch what you do with it." Mara turned to the vault's cube, now glowing with a steady, almost tranquil light. It pulsed in time with the city's new heartbeat, a rhythm that was not a countdown but a call to live with memory rather than against it. The memory's new arrangement began to spread outward from the vault like a gentle wind, rippling through the car, then through the tunnel, then out into the city's lanes and blocks. The data-bleeding clocks of the city's towers slowed their bleed, the data turning into stories rather than numbers, images rather than streams. The cables that had pulsed like nerves across the city's infrastructure glowed with a healthier electricity, more constant and less volatile. In the weeks that followed, Mara, Kale, and Ada found themselves pulled into a new rhythm of existence. The Nemos vault remained a living thing, but now it no longer felt like a sealed chamber with a guard at the door. It was a corridor that anyone could walk through, a place where memory could be consulted by any citizen who wished to understand the future by understanding the past. Kale's role shifted from guide to guardian of the gate's memory, a caretaker of the city's time, and a translator of its most delicate truths. He moved through the city with a quiet smile that never quite reached his eyes, as if he had learned to live with the certainty that the future would always consist of moments he would miss. He carried a sense of loss that was not a wound but a beacon, a reminder that to save a city's future sometimes required surrendering the very thing that allows one to be in a place where time can be controlled. Ada's journalism changed too. She no longer chased the single scoop that would break a story into viewership. She began to document memory itself, to present the city's shared memory as a living archive that could be accessed by everyone, even the unborn. Her work became a thread in the city's fabric, a way to remind people that the future's shape would be determined by the present's willingness to remember and to give away some portion of control to the larger good. The people around them, subway riders, commuters, and strangers who had once been merely silhouettes, began to narrate futures again. But those futures were tempered by the sense that every future must be built out of a memory of harm and a memory of hope alike. The city settled into a new balance, not one that allowed a single owner of time to sit in the vault and command what happened next, but one that recognized time as a shared instrument that could either divide or unite the city. Mara walked the city's streets with a pace that felt new to her, as if she had learned to walk at a tempo that aligned with time's own drift rather than against it. Sometimes she found herself in moments when the memory's weight grew heavy again, when she heard the faint voices of strangers narrating futures that might come to pass, and she would listen, not to anticipate a disaster, but to hear what they desired for themselves, for their families, for the city that had grown old enough to learn new tricks. Kale's departure from his old life, a life of constant crossing through gate after gate, became a quiet legend among the city's inhabitants. He spoke little about a return or a home, because the idea of returning had a sour tang now. It seemed that reclaiming a single place in time would be a betrayal of the principle that time belonged to the city and to every person who contributed to its story. In the months after the vault's transformation, the city saw a new phenomenon, a shared memory that didn't vanish on a new dawn. It remained, not as a permanent memory of events, but as an ongoing, accessible memory of the city's people, a living archive that was used to teach the young and remind the old. It wasn't a single story with a neat conclusion. It was a tapestry of thousands of stories that intersected and overlapped in a way that created a sense of continuity. A river that kept feeding itself with the rain, and yet never stopped flowing. The crowd in the subway where the memory began, the same car, the same dawn, became a working emblem of the city's new reality. The car would fill with passengers, all of them silent for a moment, listening to something within them that wasn't noise or news or advertisement. They would listen to the city's memory being spoken back to them through the quietist's quiet, precise hum. Some people would speak softly to one another, sharing a memory they had chosen to reveal to the other as a way of inviting trust, a way of letting time know that the future would not be built alone, but in the company of many. Time in this city did what it had not done before. It allowed ordinary moments to become extraordinary, because they were recognized as fragments of a greater whole. The dawn no longer demanded to be captured as a single event. The dawn was a chorus of countless small beginnings, each one a gesture toward the future, each one a decision to live with the memory that made survival possible. The city learned to accept the paradox that the memory loop could both trap and liberate. It could imprison a single person's desire to shape destiny, but it could also free an entire community to shoulder that burden together. The memory loop's force was still there, but it no longer functioned as a weapon. It functioned as a bridge for shared responsibility. The city grew to understand that time was not something that happened to them. It was something they performed. A ritual of endurance and collaboration. The final revelation, the city's architecture as a method, rather than a man's plan, became accepted like a polite truth. You could not claim to own the past without taking responsibility for the future. You could not demand that time bend to your will without agreeing to carry the consequences of your choices with others. And in the quiet moments at the end of a long day, Mara would sometimes catch sight of that future Mara again, a reminder from a life she might someday live if she continued to walk into tomorrow without fear. The future Mara did not approach with threats or with warnings of doom. She offered a steady, gentle nod, a sign that she recognized Mara's courage and would stand with her to watch, to record, to remember, and to help the city remember too. The city's dawns returned with a gentler insistence now. They were not mere replays of the past. They were opportunities to collaborate, to choose who would be part of the memory's telling and who would be willing to risk losing themselves in the process of healing. The memory's weight did not vanish, but it was distributed among many, which meant no single memory could dominate the city's identity again. And the last exit gate, the one Kale had spoken of with that reverent gravity, was no longer a thing someone might use to disappear from the world. It was instead a shared commitment to remain, to work within the city's life, to maintain the delicate balance between memory's power and memory's mercy. There was a sense, sometimes almost a whisper in the crowd, that Kale's sacrifice had been a necessary thing, not for his own sake, but for everyone's, a moment where one person's longing to belong elsewhere became the city's commitment to staying together. Time's line, Mara's line, Ada's line. Kale's line had fused into a new kind of plot that did not end with a villain defeated or a prophecy fulfilled, but with the recognition that the present is always capable of becoming a future other people can live inside. The city no longer needed to wait for a future to become clear. It could begin to exist as soon as people decided to remember it in common. A meshing of memory and life produced something new and beautiful, a shared memory across ages. People became aware of what it meant to carry a memory not just of a day, but of a people, an entire city's collective experience, from the subway's crowded breath to the hallways of its government buildings, from the quiet of a late-night apartment to the first notes of a street musician's song. Mara stood one morning at the platform, the quietus quietly humming in her palm. The dawn's light came in pale ribbons, and the city breathed with a steadier rhythm, as if time itself had learned to pace with human nerves. A child pressed a finger to the glass, watching a reflection of a girl who could have been her great-grandmother when the memory vault had still been a guarded secret. The child asked a question Mara had learned to expect in the city's new era. Why does the train wait for us sometimes when we're not ready to step out? The mother's answer came from a place of quiet wisdom. because time is not always in a hurry to end, and sometimes we need to learn to stay a little longer with what our memory asks us to remember. Mara's answer was not a speech about courage or destiny or the mathematics of causality. It was simply, gently, an acknowledgement of the city's shared burden and its equally shared hope, because tomorrow needs us all to be here. The years rolled forward, and the city's people moved through time's hallways with a new trust, the trust that time you'd not punish them for remembering too much, nor reward them for forgetting what they owe to one another. The Nemos Vault stood as a living monument to this trust, a place not of power's demonstration, but of humanity's consent to live in memory together. And if someone in the future asked whether a single person's sacrifice could save an entire city from the tyranny of amnesia, Mara would smile and say, "Yes, but the sacrifice wasn't to save a city from danger alone. It was to save a memory from becoming a weapon, and to teach a community how to hold on to a future by remembering yesterday well enough to understand it, and to forgive it when it misremembered itself." The city, in its quiet, stubborn way, learned to tell its own story again and again, not as a linear line to a single end, but as a braided river memory threading through present action shaping memory, memory guiding future choices. The line between old and new grew thinner, and that was precisely what Mara had hoped for when she first stepped into the Nemos Vault and saw the first threads of time's loom unspooling. On a morning when the air felt unusually bright and the sky carried a particular softness, Mara stood again on the platform, the quietus resting in her hand. She looked out at the city's long, quiet stretch of morning, a street lined with trees that wore the pale green of dawn's first leaves, a bakery waking up to the scent of warm bread, a pair of old friends who waved to one another across a crosswalk, the world moving with a patient, hopeful rhythm. And for a moment, she heard the crowd's memory, the voices of strangers narrating futures, not as an echo of the past, but as a chorus that invited her to participate in a future that would be built by many hands and minds together. She wasn't alone. None of them were alone. The memory belonged to all who lived within its current, and that was enough to carry them forward into a tomorrow they would write together, knowing that the cost of that tomorrow would be measured not in sacrifice, but in the willingness to stay and to remember. The city's story continued, a living document the citizens authored day by day, a chronicle of how a crowded subway could become a place where dawn, memory, and future could converge into something worth living for, a place where strangers could narrate futures they never lived, and those futures would still belong to them all. The end of the old era did not arrive with a single dramatic concession or a single triumphant shout. It arrived as a gentle, persistent change, a quiet decision to live with memory and to let memory live through them. And in the end, that was the city's greatest victory, to prove that even a memory intended to bind can become the very force that binds a people together, not through coercion, but through shared responsibility, and above all, the willingness to begin again in the face of fear. The city slept again, a little longer, a little deeper, its pulse steady and sure. It woke to a chorus of small daily choices that fed into a larger, enduring chorus, a memory of many futures, now living side by side in a single ordinary dawn.